Hi there, it's Tuesday, March 17th. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. In today's episode, we're still waiting to find out when and if, probably just when, the governor is going to sign the state income tax into law. But today brought a flurry of announcements of businesses leaving the state. It turns out that new building in Tennessee, where Starbucks is relocating some folks soon, has enough space for potentially thousands of employees. Curious, right? A state lawmaker from Walla Walla is going to share his concerns about the bill, which, though sold as a tax on millionaires, is feared by the business and the ag community, he says, is really a death nail. So we'll get into that. Then we got an update today on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. This is the bridge between Oregon and Washington that's been, I think they've been talking about this since like the early 2000s. Today, Governor Ferguson said we're going to build the bridge, but it's now going to happen in phases with construction, he says, starting in 2028, the contractor to be picked next year in 2027. So after that, 6 to 7 years before completion of this bridge. So Representative John Lee of Vancouver, not at all pleased with the delays, not at all pleased with the project as going forward and the design, which includes light rail across the new bridge. We'll get into some of that. And my colleague Tim Clauser has a close-up on the important legislative districts that are going to be on the ballot in November. So we've got at least 5 really key districts where Republicans are hoping there is an opportunity to potentially narrow the gap. They're so outnumbered in Olympia, as you well know, in some cases unable to stop legislation that even Washingtonians oppose, like maybe the income tax. So those 5 districts will look at where those places are and why Republicans think that Democrats may indeed be vulnerable in some of those districts. So let's dive in. It's been 5 days since the end of the 2026 legislative session, which will go down in history as the session when majority Democrats passed an income tax that Republicans argue is unconstitutional and will eventually be a tax on everyone's income. They That's their take on things. So today there have been social media posts I can't even keep up on from the business community and folks saying, that's it, we're out of here. So headline in the Seattle Times, you can see here indicating that new office space in Nashville, Starbucks is moving into. They said they're only moving a few executives, but this office space apparently has enough space for thousands, potentially holding up to 2,000 employees. So why get a space for thousands of workers if you're not planning to fill it up? Curious. Plenty of questions there. And this morning, I had a chance to interview Senator Perry Dozier, whose district includes Walla Walla. He's a wheat farmer in Waitsburg. So he's very concerned about impacts from the millionaire's tax. Again, to remind you, if you're not aware, the state legislature passed an income tax, Senate Bill 6346, on income in excess of $1 million. So you're taxed 9.9% on income above $1 million. So if you make 1.2, $1.3 million, you're taxed on that $200,000 or $300,000 in excess of the $1 million that you make annually for the state of Washington. It is, according to opponents, unconstitutional because income in the state of Washington is, your income is your property, and property in the state of Washington has to be taxed at a uniform rate so that everyone would have to pay the same rate. So their opponents say you must pass this constitutional amendment if we're going to do this. At this point, it's moving forward regardless of any amendment to the Constitution. So this morning, this conversation with Senator Perry Dozier, as I mentioned, he's a wheat farmer in Waitsburg, so he may or may not be impacted by this. If they've got a good year in farming, you might be subjected to the income tax. Bad year, maybe not so much. He's very concerned about the impact on small business owners and on the ag community in the state of Washington. So here is part of that conversation I had today with Senator Perry Dozier.
When the governor signs this income tax bill, Are things going to be better for you tomorrow? No, they're not. Your cost of living isn't going down. Your cost of living in Washington State will continue to rise. This is just, in my opinion, a litmus test to see if we can get a state income tax by a few years. If you're not going to implement it till 2028 or 2029, that's because we got to see if we can actually get it through the Supreme Court. And none of these tax reliefs actually come till that time too. So this is just again, it's a smoke and mirrors that your life is going to be better because now the wealthy are going to pay more. I've been in farming my entire life, and basically, when costs increase in whether it's for fertilizer elsewhere, if it's bought by the supplier and everything, those get passed down. I think we really saw a good example of that with the Climate Commitment Act because even though it's been raising the cost of our fuel. Obviously, everything that gets delivered to grocery stores, to department stores, comes in on vehicles that are buying that fuel. It gets moved down to the those of us that can't, absorb those costs, and we just pay more and more and more for it to offset the higher cost of delivering that.
I saw another post today on X from Rise Baking in Kent. Said they're laying off their employees and closing up shop. They did not specifically say the income tax passage in Washington state or other taxes passed in recent years are to blame, but that certainly could be the case. So we'll be following that. Thing two, Washington Republicans powerless to stop the income tax, of course, this year, in part because there are so few Republicans in the legislature. Democrats hold a 30-19 majority in the Senate and a 59-39 majority in the House. So vastly outnumbered. To get any Republican bills a hearing, let alone moved out of committees for full consideration, is next to impossible on priority bills for the minority. So if they want to hold down taxes, roll back regulations, hold state agencies accountable, tackle fraud issues like we've talked about a lot, um, eating up your taxpayer dollars, they just don't have the numbers to do it. So unless Washingtonians, voters, um, begin, closing that gap and electing more Republicans into positions of power, Republicans right now in the legislature are really powerless to stop those things. But there are some districts right now where Republicans hope they can potentially gain a seat or two or more this year. So my colleague Tim Clauser and Tim covers mostly Eastern Washington, but helps me during legislative session to cover a number of things. I can't get to all of them during session. So Tim has been wonderful in covering a lot of the legislative issues that I can't get to. So he had a conversation with our state GOP chairman, Jim Walsh, about these 5 districts where there is some hope that Republicans can maybe gain a seat or two. So here's part of that conversation. Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And joining me today is our Eastern Washington reporter, Tim Clauser, who has done a deep dive into some of the really important races for Republicans, at least this year, hoping to gain maybe a seat or two after the election later this year. You may know that Washington state Republicans are in a great disadvantage here. We've got 39 or 30-19 is the Democrat majority in the Senate, and they hold a 59-39 majority in the House of Representatives. And so we've got some priority districts this year for Republicans. And Tim, you spoke to our state GOP chairman, Jim Walsh, about this and where their focus is, where their efforts are going to be between now and the election in November. Can they gain a seat or two? That remains to be seen. So, Tim, give us an overview of what the state GOP chairman shared that he's looking into.
Yeah, so the state GOP chair, Jim Walsh, she told me that the Republican Party is looking to pick up, just 4 or 5 seats. He said they're far away from reaching a majority in either chamber. That would be a big thing to accomplish this year, as much as they would like to do so. But he said just picking up those 4 or 5 extra seats could make a difference in blocking some of the more controversial legislation that, for instance, that passed this year. We have that millionaires tax, which is essentially an income tax on high income earners, but critics are worried that it could eventually impact all everyday taxpayers. Bills that gave the attorney general's office expansive new powers. In other ones, those bills passed on pretty slim margins. So he said if they were able to pick up 4 or 5 more seats, it could change the scene of the legislature for them. And he listed some priority districts in particular. He gave me the 48th, the 10th, the 24th, and the 26th. And he said also the 5th and the 30th districts might be in play, and they might add a few more to the list. But those first four are the ones that they're most focused on. The 48th district is up north. It includes like Bellingham up to Blaine, that Northwest district that borders the Canadian border. Then you have the 10th legislative district, which is like Whidbey and Camino Islands and part of Mount Vernon. So kind of below the 42nd district. The 24th district is Forks, a lot of rural Washington across the peninsula, that far horn of the state. And then the 26th legislative district is Gig Harbor. A lot of these districts, a few of them have either one Republican in the House or a Republican senator, but they're largely dominated by Democrats. A few of them are entirely controlled by Democrats. And notably, in quite a few of these districts that GOP is looking at, you had House Democrats that came out and voted against the state income tax, showing that, they're kind of a toss up on the issue. And GOP is looking to use that as a foothold to say, hey, maybe if we find a more centrist or moderate candidate, they might perform well in this district. And I asked the chairman kind of what made a good candidate for them. And he said, someone that's able to articulate public policy and knows the issues at hand. He said, it doesn't have to be some ultra conservative. It doesn't have to be a centrist or a moderate. He said it could even be someone on the left, as long as they understand public policy. They're just looking for good candidates in general. But those are the main districts that he kind of laid out.
Some of those more moderate Democrats, you mentioned Representative Amy Wallen of Kirkland. She was the one who, pitched the alternate bill to the income tax to 6346. Hers never got a public hearing, but, she was one of the Democrats who ultimately voted against the income tax when final passage came up. So that's interesting that you mentioned her district. Maybe it's a purplish district, and that's where they want to put some focus there.
Well, I will make a correction here. The initial version of the story that came out, it mentioned the 48th district in the list of priority districts for GOP, and that would include Representative Wallen's district. That was an error on my part. It was supposed to be the 48th district, so we quickly corrected that. But like you're saying, Amy Wallen, she voted against it. She offered sort of the other take on the income tax. At the same time, though, up in the 42nd district, you have Representative Rule and Representative Timmons, who both also voted against the income tax. And in several of these other priority districts, you have Representative Shavers and a few others that voted against it. And maybe they're not even looking to replace those House Democrats that voted against the income tax. Maybe that is a tool for them. But also in a few of these districts, say the 42nd district, for example, where Timmons and Rule are both from, they have a Democrat senator as well, Sharon Shoemaker. She's retiring this year. In a few of the other districts, you have Democrat senators that are retiring. So if you have House Democrats that are willing to vote against, say, the income tax, and you have a senator that's a Democrat who voted for it, but they're retiring, if they're able to push a Republican into those Senate seats, it might help their ability to stop it in either chamber. Because I think you're well aware, it passed on a very thin margin in the House. And had they had 5 more centrist Democrats, they might have not have passed at all this year.
Wow, and it's so I mean, even picking up a seat or two for the minority would be critical, because as the legislation's introduced, into committees, right? it's up to the chair ultimately to decide whether or not those bills get a hearing at all. But then on many of these committees, it's so lopsided that then if a bill even does get a hearing, you're going to have such a minority of Republicans on that particular committee that the bill, if Democrats love it, it's going to automatically advance, and Democrat or Republicans might be just completely powerless to stop it. But if they picked up a seat or two, if that makes a difference in the committee makeup, that can make all the difference on whether legislation moves or not.
hmm the majority party is reaching a super majority, a 2/3,
Wow.
and right now Walsh says they're effectively just the loyal opposition, and they want to build up to be something different than that. Right now, where the party stands, they can't stop anything unless it's a constitutional amendment that requires a 2/3 vote to pass, which would be a super majority. So if they lose the super majority that to the Democrats, that would be a major issue for WA GOP. Um, yeah.
Jim, I know you reached out to state Democrats as well because they're going to be just as focused now that we're out of session up till election day. Did you get a sense from them as to which races they're focused on, and they just want to maybe get that super majority in both chambers?
Yeah, I reached out to the state Democratic Party for an interview as well. It was a quick turnaround, so they weren't able to do the interview, but they did send me somewhat of a lengthy statement from the chair, uh, and she essentially said she wouldn't spell out the districts, say in specific which ones they're looking at, like I had asked, but she did say that they're looking to expand the map, and continue building off of the successes that they have the last six or so election cycles since they've really solidified power in the House and Senate. But didn't say much outside of that except saying that um, they claim that voters support the income tax, or at least voters that want the rich to quote unquote pay their fair share, is what she said in the statement. But not much else other than that they are expecting court challenges to the income tax, but they're confident that it'll play out in their favor.
I can't wait to see what those next, what the challenges look like. I received an email back yesterday from former Attorney General Rob McKenna saying, "What are you hearing about next steps?" And he said, "Can't say yet, but stay tuned." So it's coming. I don't know what form that's going to look like, but it's coming for sure. Well, we're middle of March. Feels like election day is a long way out, but it comes pretty quickly. It'll be
Well,
interesting.
candidate filing starts at the beginning of May. So the November election might be months away, but we have a lot of buildup before then. Candidates are already registering with the PDC, the campaign finance disclosure site, putting in what they're raising, what they're spending. Come the beginning of May, they'll start filing, and then that's when you'll see a lot of these races really go into full swing. Then we get into the beginning of August, we're going to hit the primaries.
It's
And if there's more than two candidates running for these positions, it's going to be narrowed down to the top two, usually a Democrat and a Republican, unless they don't have anyone running from one particular party. So it might be two Democrats, two Republicans, depending on the area. But for these races, it's safe to say it's probably going to be a Democrat and a Republican. But then come November, that'll be the final spotlight to see what happens.
Mm. Well, fascinating article, Tim. Thank you for writing it up. And folks that want to check out Tim's article could go to thecentersquare.com/Washington. I got to scroll up and see what the headline of your article was. "These things are not secrets. While GOP lists priority districts for the 2026 election." It's a fascinating read. So I encourage folks to check that out. Tim, thank you again for joining us for today's episode of Washington in Focus. Along with Jim Clauser, I'm Carleen Johnson. And today we got a new price tag update on the fixed span interstate bridge replacement project between Portland and Vancouver. This is the project that has been maybe close to 20 years in the making, to replace the existing century plus old bridge that crosses over the Columbia River. And today, Governor Bob Ferguson announced that the bridge replacement project updated cost estimate is $7.65 billion. Now, They say they currently have about $5.5 billion in federal and state promised funding for this bridge. But again, this is a scaled back version because before, at least the latest project estimates late last year, were to include a bunch of upgrades for interchanges on either side of the actual bridge itself. I think they're scaling that back now because it's gotten so out of control. The cost estimates are nobody can get on board with this thing. So, what was approved today, or what was projected today to be approved from Governor Ferguson, was again this $7+ billion project, $5.5 billion they have funding for. And the governor said construction will start in 2028. Now, mind you, this is still going to be 6 to 7 years after they first shovel the first dirt for this project before anybody's driving over the bridge. And it's going to have light rail. There's been a lot of pushback on that, but it's going to have light rail. What he said today, we're not going back. This is what's going to happen. So here is part of what Governor Ferguson said today at the press conference in announcing what they're moving ahead with.
More than 140,000 vehicles use the interstate bridge every single day. The current bridge, however, is not built to modern standards and is at risk of collapse in an earthquake. According to the environmental impact statement, quote, this collapse potential is due to the fact that hundreds of timber bridge support piles sit within loose sand that can liquefy during an earthquake. That's unacceptable. Like any major project of this magnitude, there's going to be good news and bad news along the way. Recently, we got some great news. The U.S. Coast Guard approved a fixed span for a replacement bridge instead of requiring us to build a movable span like the current bridge. We also recently received some not so good news. Not surprisingly, costs have gone up since our last projection several years ago. I'm here today with key project partners to make it clear that we are all committed to moving forward with a core set of projects to replace our bridge with a modern fixed span structure, including light rail. The Interstate Bridge Replacement Program today released updated cost estimates. The program now estimates that will cost $7.65 billion to do the following: replace the northbound and southbound spans of the bridge, connect the new bridges to I-5, and extend light rail to Vancouver.
Now, back in late January, I had a chance to interview Representative John Lee of Vancouver, who is on the bi-state bipartisan work group that's been tracking all of the changes to the design through multiple federal administration changes. He is vehemently opposed to putting trains on the bridge, but we heard today from Governor Ferguson that train has left the station. It's going to happen. He says, we're not going back on any old design changes. So he says trains are certainly going to be on the new bridge. But Representative Lee tried to get a bill heard during this session to audit the entire program because they have spent millions, in fact, hundreds of millions of dollars on design, on consultants, on marketing for this, without anything even being finalized. We don't even still have the federally approved environmental impact statements. Apparently that's coming in later this year. And Governor Ferguson said today things will not be, off track as a result of whatever the feds he expects to get from them. But here's what Representative John Lee had to say about this project in my conversation with him in late January.
I've been watching the I-5 Interstate Bridge Replacement Program for well over a decade, back when it was the Columbia River crossing. It's an outrageous boondoggle. It started at low end of $3.2 billion. It has now exploded. 2 weeks ago, we learned the top end could be over $18 billion. It's ridiculous. The amount of money that they've spent is about $250 million. So late this afternoon, I filed a bill calling for a performance audit of the entire program. Not only do we want to know, is the money properly accounted for, but are they doing what they're supposed to? The initial proposal was transit was $2 billion out of the $7.5 billion project, over a quarter of it. Absolutely ridiculous. They're replacing a 3-lane bridge with another 3 through-lane bridge. Ridiculous when the West Coast, hugely bad in terms of traffic congestion. Everybody's stuck. We got to dig in before we waste 6, 8, 10, 12, $17 billion of the people's money. It's ridiculous, and we've got to stop it. We don't want a big dig like Boston. We don't want a California high-speed rail that wastes huge amounts of the people's money and delivers nothing.
Now, remember, the project would also update the 5-mile stretch of the I-5 corridor around the bridge, including, I think there were 7 highway interchanges. They wanted to replace the North Portland Harbor Bridge. The full cost, if you include everything they wanted to do, and they still plan to do in phases later, I guess, is $14.5 billion. So during the press conference today, when Governor Ferguson was asked about future funding, phases of the projects, how are you going to get that funding? Will you get that funding? He basically gave no definitive answer. He said, we'll get to that bridge. We'll cross a bridge when we get there. Right. That's probably a bad thing to say on this project, but offered no specifics whatsoever. But again, 2028, he says they will begin construction. No specifics again today on who's going to build this thing. What's the contract look like? I guess everything's out for bids now. Sometime next year, we'll find out who the contractor is going to be for this. Oregon and Washington are certainly going to fight for, their union labor to have a piece of the pie, and I'm sure that'll be shared. But that's going to be another interesting angle that we promise to follow on this. So thank you for watching. That's it for March the 17th, our St. Patrick's Day, I wore my green, episode of Washington in Focus Daily. I looked up, right before we started recording this, I looked up Luck of the Irish Blessings. I like this one, so I'll share it for you. It says, may your pockets be heavy and your heart be light. May good luck pursue you each morning and night. I don't know, kind of corny, but it's fitting for today. So thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.